Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. If you haven't already done so, don't forget to download my free downloadable planner journal on www.cupofparenting.com/planner. So, a few weeks ago, I was asked to do this talk titled Parenting Challenges for Muslim Parents, and I thought it'd be useful just to go over it again, inshallah. So, we're going to split this into three parts, inshallah. First, we're going to have a look at the challenges parents face when parenting. Secondly, I'll give you some practical strategies that you can apply. And thirdly, we'll really briefly look at some positive parenting tips because this is what I teach, inshallah. Let's begin. Let's start with a story. Now, this is a true story that happened here in the city that I live in, where a family was super worried about their teenage child, and they approached the imam in the mosque and asked if he can go to the house to speak to the child because he was talking about things that concern the parents. So the imam agreed. He went to the house, he chatted to the child. He was very educated, a really lovely lad, and he had some questions when it came to religion. And his actual issue was that he said that his mom and dad were unable to answer his questions, and actually conversely, when he approached them, they got upset and they got angry, and they weren't speaking to him properly in this regard. Now, after that conversation happened, a young speaker that was quite well known came to the mosque, and the imam encouraged the parents to bring the child to the mosque so they can sit down and have a chat, because he might be able to resonate with him being young, etc., and answer some of his questions. But for whatever the reason, they were unable to do this and they didn't bring him. A little while later after that, they got in touch again, and this time they were devastated because they said that their son had left Islam now, and that was obviously really upsetting for the family. And this story is not an isolated case. These kind of things are happening. And the biggest concern and takeaway from this is actually the disconnect, which is quite apparent and evident, between these youngsters and teenagers and their parents. And it's happening more and more, and it's more prevalent. And it all comes back down to the issue of, why is there a disconnect? Is there an issue, when it comes to the parenting, and what kind of parenting strategies or styles are being used? Now, let's go back to the beginning. When does parenting actually start? I would argue that it starts way before the child's born, maybe at the time of marriage or even beforehand. When you're thinking about parenting, before you even, conceive a child, you should be thinking that after that child is born, inshallah, what kind of parenting strategies will I be using? There's so many different styles that you can use, and there's different impact of the different styles. You should be aware of the parenting strategies that were used with yourselves when you were younger. In my parenting course, in one of the weeks, I actually asked the parents to revisit their childhood, and sometimes it's quite traumatic, but it's important to do so because then that shapes how you are as a person. And it doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily repeat the same strategies that were used with you, but at least you'll be more educated and more aware of them, inshallah. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already told us in Surah Taghabun that your wealth and your children are only a fitna, whereas Allah with him is a great reward. So parenting isn't easy. When your children come home from the hospital, you don't bring a manual with them, subhanallah. But what you do know is that you can follow the Quran and Sunnah and try and do the best for them as a parent. That's all you can do. You can try your best. You can make lots of dua, and the rest is up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on how that person and individual is guided. But don't neglect your duties, because they're a blessing and responsibility from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're a precious amana. What are we doing to equip ourselves? We should be thinking about that way beforehand. Let's look at some of the challenges that children are facing in this day and age. One of the major ones is the challenges that come with media. Now, I've got a whole video on the challenges of social media that you can have a look at. And it's not just social media. When you think about media, think about film, TV, what they're consuming, what apps they're using, who they're talking to. But gaming is a massive one that a lot of children are consuming these days. And it's very different to when we were younger and gaming was available, because these children are talking to people online at the same time as gaming, often, not always, but often. And a lot of the time, these are strangers. Sometimes they might know the people, but sometimes they might not. And as parents, it's your responsibility to be monitoring this and be aware of this. I'm not saying have cameras on your children and, don't trust them at all. But I am saying it is a very dangerous time out there. There's definitely a lot more out there than, a lot of dangers out there. And in schools, they'll teach them now about internet safety, about cyberbullying, these things that didn't exist, because they do exist now and they are harmful to children now. Look at the cases of children who have resorted to suicide because of bullying online by some people that they knew, but also strangers that they didn't know, because it's really easy to do things online that you might not do in real life. So as parents, you should definitely be aware of what kind of content your child is consuming, who they are in touch with, what are they doing, what apps are they using. As parents, it's your responsibility to at least know this, inshallah. Another challenge is when it comes to balancing culture and religion. So a lot of times I see when children are growing up that obviously they'll be exposed to their parents' culture, and it might be a different culture to the one that they're growing up in. So it might be your parents were from a different country to the one you're growing up in. It might be that there's two different parents from two different cultures. But the important thing is, especially when it comes to big celebrations and events, that actually you're quite clear with them on what's halal and what isn't, because sometimes you might justify doing things and say, oh, well, you do them in our culture. And that might confuse children, because then those children might think, well, is that allowed then, or is it not allowed? So that's something to be wary of. So definitely, obviously, educate them about your culture. That is great, because that shaped who you are. That's to do with your family, your background, your whole lineage. But at the same time, be really aware and sensitive to what is allowed and not allowed, and whether that, how that balances and mixes with what you're practicing in terms of your deen, inshallah. Another huge issue is mental illness that we're seeing. All you need to do is a really quick Google search to have a look at the amount of children, it's not even just children, it's adults as well, but obviously we're talking about children today, that are suffering from mental health issues. Now, I know of someone who got in contact with me because they said that somebody that they knew was suffering from mental health issues, but it just resorted to arguments with the parents because they were almost, culturally embarrassed, or it was a taboo, it was brushed under the carpet. And how many people are there that are suffering from mental health issues now in adulthood because it wasn't dealt with when they were younger, and the parents didn't know how to deal with it, or they would just say, well, just cheer up and they'll be fine. Just go out for a walk, they'll be fine. Instead of addressing the root cause of the issue. If your child was physically ill, what would you do? You would get medical attention. You take them to the doctor, to the GP. And if they got more ill, you would take them to the hospital. You'd seek medical attention. But you don't do the same a lot of the times for mental health, because it's not visible to the naked eye, even though it's probably more harmful to the child, to the child's behavior, to the family. It's something that can really affect them. So just be aware if that is something that's, affecting your loved ones, that you're seeking the proper help and support for that child then, inshallah. Another issue is when it comes to schooling. Are you aware of everything that's been taught to your child in school, especially nowadays? And does that align with your own values and beliefs? Does your child know how to respectfully approach if there are things that are being practiced in a school, especially if it might have been in a non-Muslim country, for example? There might not be what your child believes in. How are you dealing with this? These are things that shouldn't be ignored. I remember when something happened in school a couple of years ago, something was being taught, and it was really interesting to see the different categories of parents. There were those that were bothered but didn't do anything. There were those that were bothered that went and spoke to the teachers and wanted to know exactly what was going on. And there was those that were just oblivious, like, all right, okay, well, it's not my issue, because it's almost like you hand your children over and then you think that's okay because they're going to be fine and you don't need to question it. But as parents, you should always be questioning what is going on in the child's environment and what they're learning and from who. So just be careful of that, inshallah. Now let's see some practical examples that you can apply. One of them is your home environment. I always say that's the most important thing. Modeling behavior. So if you want your child to do something, for example, offer salah, give charity, be a nice person, are you doing these things yourself? Is this what they see on a day-to-day basis? Do they see you being charitable and happy and smiling and being respectful? Do they see you offering the salah and the prayers? If they do, then that's good, because then they can model it and see that that's the norm. But if they don't, then think about that. Another one is obviously look at the example of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. How did he interact with the youth? Right, he was very affectionate and respectful with the youth. So this is how we should be in our approach as well, inshallah. Another one is to have open communication with your children, especially teenagers, who is hard enough communicating with them as it is, isn't it, when they reach a certain age. But I always say to parents, have an open line of communication. If there is something that's bothering them, if there is a time when they're feeling upset or something severe or serious has happened, you should be the first person that they think of to come to approach for support with that issue, inshallah, not seeking it elsewhere, because you should have that relationship with them. For example, if they're coming home from school or college and you're collecting them, that 10 minutes that you have in the car, are you speaking to them about what happened in their day? Because sometimes if you don't catch them at that crucial time, they'll probably not speak to you afterwards, and it's really important that you spend that time with them, trying to find out what happened in their day, what's going on in their life, who their friends are. Do you know who their friends are and who those friends' families are and what their values are? What kind of things that they're up to, inshallah. You should know all of this. Always notice and always ask when things are, if they're not as they seem. It's good that you should be able to catch that early on and speak to them and be transparent with them, and that they can approach you, inshallah. Now I'll give you some positive parenting tips, inshallah. Let's have a look at some positive parenting tips now. What is positive parenting? Positive parenting is when you're firm and fair with the child, and you bring them up with love and guidance, but they also have boundaries and they know what they can and can't do, and they also know the consequences of their actions as well. But the most important thing is, as parents, you understand the belief behind the children's behavior. So we always show an iceberg as a model. You always see a bit of the ice on the top of the iceberg, which is the action or the behavior of the child, but oftentimes you won't see the belief behind the behavior, which is a huge bit of the iceberg under the water. And this is the part that explains why they're behaving in certain ways. And this is so important for you as parents to understand. I'm just going to give you a really brief example of the model of the brain in the palm of your hand, inshallah, from Dr. Daniel Siegel. So you can have a look online if you want to. And just really quickly, using your hand model. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can pick your hand up and really quickly do this to understand. Because the reason why it's important is this is a hand model of the brain, right? And it's important that when you understand how the brain functions and how the different parts of it function, then you can change your behavior, modify your behavior in that way, because then you'll know why you're behaving in certain ways. So you've got your spinal cord that comes up into the wrist, then you have your brain stem here, and then the thumb is representing the limbic area. And these work together to regulate your arousal, your emotions, and the way you have a fight, flight, freeze response. So these are all below the cortex. And then if you fold your fingers over, this part is the cortex. And this lets you do your thinking, your logical reasoning, perceiving the outside world. So then if you imagine this part as being, the front part of your brain, if you're thinking of it as a brain model, this is the part that regulates what's going on down below. Now, this regulation is super important, because sometimes imagine like you're really angry or upset, or you're emotional and you get triggered, or some little people come and they know exactly how to push your buttons. What happens? You say what we say in positive parenting is you flip your lid, and now you are dysregulated. You're not thinking, rationally. You're really upset. So when we're in a state like this, we're obviously not tuned in or regulated. When we're talking to our children or trying to parent, you're actually angry and upset, and you might say things that you regret later on and that you wouldn't normally say. But here's the important part. Remember what we said about your children modeling you. So if you flipped your lid, imagine they have copied you, and now they're also dysregulated and flipped their lid because they're mirroring you, remember? So now what happens? This is a really bad time to, do parenting. So alhamdulillah, Islam teaches us how we can get back into this state, when we're nicely regulated. There's things that we can do as Muslims. We can sit down if we're standing up, we can drink water, we can say A'udhu Billah, seek refuge in Allah, etc. But The point is that if we can even teach this to 5, 6-year-old children and explain to them, when the anger's building up, what's about to happen. And if you can explain that to them, and you can also explain to them that sometimes adults get upset and angry, and that actually you can then acknowledge when you're angry and then apologize to the child, and maybe when you've calmed down, do your parenting after that when you're regulated again, then that's a really good strategy and tip for you to use, inshallah. I hope you found this useful, inshallah. If you did, don't forget to watch the next podcast on parenting. I'll see you next time. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.